Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. The best biographies reveal the raw humanity behind lives of rare genius. In his latest book, Jeffrey Meyers draws on Plutarch's principle of dual composition to shed fresh light on some of the figures who did so much to shape our world. Why did Edmund Wilson and Alan Tate burn their friendship with a literary feud, while Thomas Mann and Sigmund Freud avoided a similar fate? How did the clash of two monumental egos, one of them the son of a prime minister, nearly derail a theater of war? What connected screen legend Audrey Hepburn to a teenage girl killed in a Nazi extermination camp? That's what we're talking about today. This is my second conversation with Jeffrey. He joined me on episode 41 of Personal Landscapes to discuss the novelist James Salter. If you enjoyed today's episode, you'll want to go back and listen to that one. Jeffrey Meyers is the author of an astonishing 55 books of biography and literary criticism, including works on Ernest Hemingway, Scott Fitzgerald, Humphrey Bogart, and the director John Huston. He's been translated into 14 languages and published on 6 continents, and he's one of 12 Americans in the Royal Society of Literature. A quick note before we jump in. You've heard me mention on previous episodes that I have a new book out this year. It's called A Sunny Place for Shady People, and it's about 6 years I spent living on the island of Malta. I set out to write a breezy island book, but during my time there I saw the government of a European Union member state taken over by serious criminals. I drew on travel writing, anthropology, and political reportage to show why this could only happen in Malta. I think the roots of it all are deeply embedded in the culture. That little island is a very strange place, and it's far more interesting than the casual visitor might imagine. A Sunny Place for Shady People is a funny book, at least in the first half, with clashes of culture, history, and strange characters, and then it becomes increasingly dark. The writer Sarah Wheeler called it True Crime in the Sun. It's published by Trinity University Press in the US, and in a new paperback edition by Mid-Sea Books in Malta. You can find more information about it on my website. If you like the sort of books we talk about on this podcast, then I think you'll like mine. I hope you'll check it out. And now, here's my conversation with Jeffrey Meyers. I want to begin by asking you about the format of the book. Why did you decide to write about these subjects in this way, as dual compositions or mirror images?
Well, the model, as I say in the preface and the title, is Plutarch's Parallel Lives, a Greek writer, classic. And he took pairs of famous people, historical figures, including Julius Caesar and Alexander and people that we'd still recognize, and paired them partly, in his case, for moral reasons, to show one being superior in his life and the other being perhaps cruel or a failure or whatever. I wasn't interested in moral judgments, but I had written about most of these people individually, singly, and as I was writing about them, I thought of comparisons. And instead of looking at them singly, which I had already done, I wanted to look at them in pairs and see them reflecting off each other, how one illuminated the other. Sometimes they were friends. Sometimes they started as friends and wound up as enemies. Sometimes they never knew each other, but had this very, very strong identification with each other. Sometimes the parallels in their lives even surprised me. When I started writing. Of course, once you get into it, you get this idea and you think, oh, let's compare whatever, Wilson and Nabokov or whoever. And you start seeing more and more things. And as a biographer, I've written many biographies of people, and sometimes I've written dual biographies like of Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe. Sometimes I've written a book called Married to Genius, which are chapters about the marriages of modern writers. So I've always been interested in this kind of pairing and paralleling. But the essence is Plutarch is the model, and you have this kind of reflection of one over the other where you can see more and understand more if you see two of them together rather than seeing them individually, which I had already done, and now I was doing it in a new way.
So what's the standing of Plutarch today within the biographical canon? Like, is he still read as much as he would have been in the past?
Well, I doubt if many people even heard of him. Uh, he's important to classicists. He's important to. There is a bit of a revival in classics now. I don't know if you've noticed. There are books about Mary Beard, for example, writes about famous Romans or Roman emperors, or there's books on various Roman and Greek poets. I think there's a bit of a revival, but not in classical languages, only in translation. I just this last week reviewed a new book on Homer, published by Princeton by a German academic. I didn't think much of it. It was really very heavy going and not all that illuminating, very Germanic, pedantic. But the point is that Princeton thought it was worth translating and publishing that book. So I think classics are reviving a bit for people who know absolutely nothing about it. For example, I had an extra copy of the book. They sent me two. So I brought it into a bookstore to sell. And the woman behind the desk had never heard of Homer, though she's working in a bookstore.
Where was this? This was
In Berkeley.
Jeez.
I mean, maybe she was on drugs. She looked kind of stupefied when I showed it to her. She just said, "Oh, what's this?" Oh, I said, Homer, isn't it? Homer, who's that? She thought it had something to do with baseball.
Or The Simpsons. I was surprised you didn't get that reference. God, that's unbelievable. So your subjects cover a little more than a century, from the birth of Sigmund Freud to the death of Sylvia Plath. So 1856 to 1963. How did you decide who you wanted to include?
Well, over the years, I'd been writing these essays. I didn't sit down and write the book from beginning to the end at one shot. It was really a matter of writing one here. Let's say, for example, the Nabokov Wilson one, which was the most important friendship in the life of both of them. And in my view, they're both very, very great writers. I'd written this big biography of Edmund Wilson, 600 pages, which is long for me. And when Nabokov fled Europe, his wife is Jewish, and the Germans had just invaded France. The story is he got the last ship out, maybe so. Anyway, he comes to America. All his books have been written in Russian, and he's introduced to Wilson, and Wilson immediately recognizes it. Wilson knew Russian, by the way. Immediately recognized that Nabokov was really a very important writer. And of course, if anybody ever met Nabokov in person, you'd have to be tremendously impressed by him. I mean, I never met him, of course, but I've read all his works, and I read some of his works 2 or 3 times. So they started off as tremendous friends with Wilson, who was a big shot in American publishing, helping Nabokov get started, getting his books published in English, helping him, being friends. Wilson overreached himself a bit by claiming to know more Russian than he really had, and you don't really go up against Nabokov in Russian any more than you'd go up against anybody a literate man in his native language against you as somebody who learned Russian in middle age when he went to Russia. He was in a hospital for a long time, and he studied the language. He was very good at languages. I mean, he was learning Hebrew and Hungarian when he was in his 70s. Just for the fun of learning the language. But unfortunately, Wilson wrote a negative review of Nabokov's rather pedantic and rather unsuccessful translation, very literal translation of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, which Nabokov typically called Eugene Onegin, which he loved puns. Puns are out of favor, but it seems to me the three of the greatest writers in English, Shakespeare, Swift, and Joyce, all were terrific punsters. And I love to slip puns into my work and hope that the editors won't object or get me into a fight where I struggle to keep my puns. I really love them. Anyway, they had this quarrel, which was really very unfortunate. And that's the trajectory of that chapter. A tremendous friendship, power shifting from Wilson to Nabokov when you get onto Nabokov's territory. And then this kind of quarrel, which was, I think, regretted on both sides, but inevitable. The best way to lose a friend is to write a negative review of his book. I mean, that's not really that's not really a great idea to maintain the friendship. You get plenty of bad reviews from your enemies. You don't need them from your friends. You count on them to help you, or at least if they don't like your work, to remain silent. Wilson wrote Memoirs of Hecate County, which was banned in Massachusetts, but he didn't like Lolita, which to me is Nabokov's greatest book, with a real, I think, not immoral, not pedophile, but if you read the book properly, as I think I do, it's Lolita who's in control of that situation, not Humbert. All she has to do is pick up the phone and call police and say, this man is having sex with me and I'm only 14 years old. I mean, he'd just be pulled into jail for years. So he really has to handle her at the same time, terribly, I mean, with sexual passion at the same time with fear and trembling, because you can see even when they're riding in the car in the movie, and there's two movies of Lolita, and one of them is really the one with, this is Kubrick one with James Mason. It's fabulous. Anyway, that's an example of Wilson Nabokov. You start off with looking at them singly. You see how Nabokov comes into Wilson's life. You sort of extract that and just focus on these two people and tell, which I've just said very briefly, what it's like when they start off with friendship, intensity. I mean, these are two brilliant guys. I mean, how many people can really talk to Nabokov and Wilson at their level of knowledge and understanding and sophistication and wit and experience? I mean, that's like the friend of your lifetime. How many people have you ever known in your life who have that kind of brilliance? So it's sad. It's sad. It's very sad but Wilson didn't. It was wrong to criticize a friend, and it was wrong, foolish, to challenge a Russian like Nabokov in the Russian language.
So you said that their friendship was not based on similar views of life and art, but for a long time they seemed able to argue about these intellectual issues, and sometimes quite heatedly, and they remained friends. So what changed? Was it just the bad review that just kind of poisoned everything?
It was a combination of the negative review, and God knows it was a lousy translation of Pushkin. I mean, it was very ill-conceived to make it almost word by word from Russian to English, not trying to make it literary at all. I mean, there's not that much difficulty in understanding what Pushkin is saying. You could and there are other translations in verse and probably in prose. And, there's the opera by Tchaikovsky, and then there's all kinds of, probably a zillion versions in Russian that we don't even know about. So the one thing is a negative review, and the other thing is challenging them on Russian and just having the floor wiped from them because Nabokov took out his big guns. And then there was this visit when Wilson went up to see Nabokov in Ithaca at Cornell. And I don't know, he said something in Upstate, some things that seemed to reflect badly on Nabokov's honor, he wasn't treated properly, or his wife wasn't dressed respectfully, or, some really peccadillo that some Russian quasi-nobleman would call you out for a duel a la Pushkin. So he took exception to Upstate. I can't exactly remember what it was, but it's not something that you normally get all excited about. I mean, if I said to you, I don't know, your nose looks funny, I mean, would that be the end of our friendship for all time? You have to sort of take that as it comes and move on, but he just wanted to, he was touchy, and he was just on the turn of becoming world famous. He could leave his job at Cornell and move to Geneva. I mean, not Geneva, but to Montreux, and devote himself to writing and to chasing butterflies, which are the two things that he really liked doing the most. It's interesting that he never moved out of the Rocky Mountains once he had moved to America. You'd think he'd want to go to Asia and find some of those butterflies that Alfred Russel Wallace wrote about in the Malay archipelago, and you can imagine the butterflies they have in Asia. They must be just out of this world for a butterfly man.
Was he much of a traveler, Nabokov?
Only when he was forced from country to country. I mean, he was forced out of Russia by the revolution. He was forced out of Germany by the Nazis. He was forced out of France by the invasion by the Germans. And then once he got to America, I don't know, then he moved to Switzerland, where Fitzgerald said, few things begin, but many things end. A lot of famous writers died in Switzerland. Why? Because if you're rich, you can go there and have a quiet, peaceful life. And you go there at the end of your life and you have a lot of money, and there's not a lot of future there. So when he got to Montreux, did he travel? No, he didn't travel much. That I can remember. He had already been in all these places. He used to go to Milan to hear his son sing. His son sang in La Scala. Whatever his name was, Nicholas, I think his name was. Not Nicholas, what was his name? Dmitri, named after Nabokov's father. So that's just one example, but we could talk about others. We should talk about others.
This brings up one thing I want to ask you about. Several of the juxtapositions in your book involve literary feuds. So what is it about literary feuds that make them such an enthralling spectator sport?
Well, in some ways, you're sorry that these feuds occur. On the other hand, there's fireworks. I mean, you're talking about bright people, touchy people. I find now, in old age, that a lot of my closest friends, of course, are dead, because most of my friends throughout my life are older than me. But people get very touchy somehow. Maybe this goes back to Wilson Nabokov. And just at a time when you should clutch on to the last friends who are still alive and not demented, people get very touchy about nothing and fly off the handle. You know, they ask you their opinion of something that hasn't been published yet. You try to give a constructive comment, and if it's not entirely positive, they go berserk. I mean, this happened to somebody who's a friend for 50, 60 years and who just died a couple of months ago. So what is it? It's just that it's fireworks, and it's brilliant, interesting, complicated, sympathetic, angry people flying off the handle and going at each other. And it's something like a bad marriage. I mean, how is it? Luckily, I have never had to experience this myself, but first you fall in love with somebody and want to get married. And then a few years later, or whatever it is, you hate them. And, you get into this bitter divorce, and a friend of mine was a divorce lawyer, and he said, why don't you just have a kind of friendly disagreement and friendly separation? Oh, no, I just want to take this guy. I want every cent out of him. I want to put the knife at his throat. This desire for vengeance. So I think that's what it is, this combination. Or maybe give me a specific example of what you think about a quarrel. The opposite. Let me talk about the opposite, which is this kind of tremendously sympathetic identification. I think, to me, the most moving and sweet chapter in the book is the Anne Frank and Audrey Hepburn.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because if I had to choose a favorite actress, it would be Audrey Hepburn, and she lived an incredible life. So why did you pair those two together? Her with someone whose life was all too brief.
I knew all about Anne Frank, and I started investigating Audrey Hepburn when I was doing the book on Gary Cooper. And also I wrote some introductions to 4 screenplays by Billy Wilder's son her. She was in Cooper's Love in the Afternoon, and she was in Wilder's Sabrina. And of course, she's a very sympathetic person. If you don't know anything about her, you just look at Audrey Hepburn, you see her in the films, and you think, oh God, what a sweet, charming woman she is. In fact, I once saw her in Topkapi in Istanbul.
Oh, wow.
I didn't think of anything to say to her. I didn't want to go up and say, oh, I just love your pictures. But anyway, I watched her. Some sailors came up to her, American sailors who were, and she was very, very charming with them. And, she did say, don't bother me or anything like that. So I started looking into Audrey Hepburn, and I was really surprised in a way. I didn't realize that she was Dutch. I didn't realize that she has grown up in Holland during the war. I didn't realize that she was almost the same age as Anne Frank. I didn't realize that she had undergone the same terrible wartime deprivations. The only difference was that she was Christian and Anne Frank was Jewish. And if Audrey Hepburn had been Jewish, she would have wound up just like Anne Frank on the last train out of Amsterdam to the concentration camp, not to the extermination camps. And Anne Frank, I mean, her death was even worse than the gas ovens because it went on and on and on. And she thought everybody in the family had died. And it's this Anne Frank. I think she's a brilliant writer, even as a girl, as a teenager, as an adolescent. I mean, I think if she had lived, she would have been a really important writer, somebody like Simone Weil. So I start seeing, well, imagine Audrey Hepburn. She's Dutch, she's this, she's this. Her mother was pro-Nazi. Her mother was a sort of lower noblewoman. What do you call it? The bottom of the noble class, if there is such a thing. So I was just fascinated by this. And then Audrey Hepburn naturally identified with Anne Frank and thought, as I just said, this could have happened to me easily. In fact, she took a risk. She was a courier for the underground, or she said she was. Nobody ever denied that story. I think she took a certain risk. She did see people shot in the street as hostages or as whatever it is, anti-Nazi resistance riders. And then she met Otto Frank when he came back from the dead, so to speak, Anne's father. And they wanted her to play Anne Frank in a film. And she just couldn't go through it all again. It was just too emotionally wrenching. I think she made the right decision. I mean, it's just too horrible to relive again. Also, she didn't feel she should get anything out of playing Anne Frank. So I'm afraid the movie and the plays weren't very good. They tended to sentimentalize her, and she made this one statement, which I don't think is justified by her whole life. I think in the end, human beings are really good people, or something like that. That's not what comes out of her experience in the war and the extermination camps. She almost escaped. She was, I think the Russians came into the camp, just a week or two after she had died. They were moving east all this time, and they were moving people from the camps in Poland to the camps in Germany. Meanwhile, destroying the camps in Poland, try to show that the camps didn't exist, that there was no evidence. So I found that very, on one hand, I kept discovering all these connections between the two, right down to Otto Frank and Audrey Hepburn. And seeing Anne Frank from Audrey Hepburn's point of view, to me, was really deeply moving and illuminating. I thought that chapter worked especially well.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites in the book too, and also I didn't realize how dire things were in the Netherlands. You said 75% of Jews in the Netherlands were taken away to be murdered. There's a higher percentage than anywhere else in Western Europe. I didn't realize that, and also how much of a role the Dutch government played in it.
It was a Dutchman who betrayed the whole Frank family, some kind of disaffected employee of Otto Frank's business. But one thing that's worth saying here, it's slightly off the subject, is that there were two countries in Europe who resisted the German extermination of the Jews, in Denmark and, strangely enough, in Bulgaria. Todorov wrote a whole book about this. So that if the national government opposed the deportation and murder of the Jews, the Nazis left off. They just kind of left the Jews alone. And in Denmark, something like 10 Jews were killed during the war. And in Holland, I don't know how many, 20,000 or something. So I thought that was really interesting, that when the Jews were killed, the governments were complicit. And, the Ukrainians and the Poles just couldn't get their hands on enough Jews to murder.
It was really interesting. Your comparison of Anne Frank's writing as a young adolescent girl, the angst that she suffered, the issue, not separate from the war, but just to, developing as a girl that age, and how you paralleled that with Audrey Hepburn, who lived within 60 miles of each other, you said, and were born just 6 weeks apart. So she could relate to her, the other aspects of life that she was going through at that time, the war stuff aside.
The identification was really complete. And in fact, Audrey said, and Audrey seems to be an intelligent woman, I could have written that myself, or not maybe as brilliant literary style, but I could have written that myself if I had been in Anne Frank's situation, that is to say, confined in the secret annex for, 3 years, something like that, 2 or 3 years. it was the whole history of the publication of Anne Frank, because Otto censored Anne's criticism of her mother, anything that had to do with sex, which was really pretty interesting. Not that she had a wild sex life, far from it, but she talked about periods and breasts and certainly her attraction to that boy, Peter. I mean, how could you not be here? You're in this little tiny annex and here's this young boy your age. I mean, he wasn't up to Anne intellectually, but he was kind of immature, I suppose. But I mean, there was no one else there. I mean, of course, she had a crush on him, and they exchanged secrets. I don't think anything happened between them. But Otto cut all that out, and it wasn't until much later that the full text. And now, when you look at the Anne Frank books, it says the complete text, or the unabridged text, or the real text, or the whole text. You know, that's what you have to read.
Another one I found quite interesting, who were two people who knew each other, were Sigmund Freud and Thomas Mann. And could you give us a sense of the world that they were living in at that time and how they came into contact?
Well, this was, I think it was the 30s particularly. Of course, they knew each other's work. Freud was older by, 18 years or something like that. The interesting thing about that is, it's very German. On anniversaries, you stand up and you give a speech saying how great the other, Heinrich and Thomas. Heinrich was his older brother. Every 60 or 70 or 80 years, they get up and make a speech saying how great the other. I remember going, when I was with friends in France and Germany, and they'd take me to some little academic event, and they'd give all these incredibly boring speeches about, how wonderful this person being feted was. The thing about Mann, he could take what he needed from Freud, especially the sexual theories and the idea of the unconscious. But basically, he was skeptical, and a lot of what he said about Freud as a compliment was kind of insincere, or he avoided the subject. And like many great men, instead of talking about Freud, he talked about himself. It's just really kind of funny. But when they met, they did get on. There's no question about that. They liked each other. They respected each other. There's nothing nicer than somebody coming to your house and saying how much he admires you. And that's what Mann was willing to do to Freud. Whereas Mann, his whole life, everybody's coming to Mann and saying how great Mann is. And it was very unusual that Mann would pay this kind of honor. He did it to some extent to Gerhard Hauptmann, the German playwright, who's the model for Peppercorn in the Magic Mountain. I should mention, by the way, that just the other day, on Friday, I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal on the 100th anniversary of the Magic Mountain.
Yes, you sent it to me. I enjoyed that.
I only had 800 words, but you had to learn how to compress it. So I think it's each one saying, Guten Tag, Herr Freud, Guten Tag, Herr Mann, and taking off their hat. The French say chapeau bas, take off the hat. And it's this cliche of mutual admiration, but it had to do with this Germanic thing of celebrating anniversaries. And to me, it was really interesting to see Mann playing the courtier in a way at a time when, he had won the Nobel Prize in 1929. So that's what interested me, the kind of genuine feeling combined with a certain insincerity, that sort of fake admiration, which wasn't really there.
So what was Freud's standing at that time? Like, psychoanalysis had a huge influence on writers like Lawrence Durrell, who came later, and that sort of circle. But was it in the air at this time when they first met, or did that widespread influence come later?
Well, I think Freud had been publishing his works from the late 1890s, the early 1900s. So I think that stuff was out there for anybody who wanted to read it, certainly in the German-speaking world. And then eventually through Lytton Strachey's brother translated Freud into English. And Ernest Jones wrote this three-volume biography of Freud. That came later, of course, after Freud's. So yes, I mean, those ideas were there. People knew about it. Anybody who was educated in Germany would know who Freud was and what his basic ideas were. And in fact, he writes in a pretty clear way. It's not hard to understand what Freud is saying. You might not agree with what he's saying. You might wonder whether sex is what really drives people more than anything else, and whether there is such a thing as the unconscious, and whether dreams mean something. I had a very elaborate dream last night, and it was so much that it woke me up. So just before I woke up, I remembered everything about it. It was really quite disturbing and unpleasant. And that made me think of Freud. Very often I write down, I have so many dreams written down that I stopped doing it. But I thought of Freud because I thought, what does this dream mean? I have all these incredibly exact, memorable details of something that just was in my head just a few minutes ago. What does it all mean? And what Freud tells you is it does mean something. So what does it mean? You want to know what it means. And he made you want to explore that side of the human mind, the human consciousness. Also, I think Freud was brave, physically brave. They were meeting in the mid-30s. You know, Freud stayed in Vienna till 1938, which is pretty late. And he was just bought out by Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was a direct descendant of Napoleon and very wealthy. And she was a princess and very influential. And of course, he had to give up everything, you know, his apartment, everything he had, all his money, all his huge collection of antiquities from Egypt and Greece and Rome. And he had to sign this statement. He had the nerve to say, "Yet I recommend the Gestapo to anybody who would need their services." I thought that was really
That's a great story.
And I say, wait a minute, Siggy, we're not letting you go when you say something like that. Also, he had something like 20 operations on his jaw for cancer. And it was like Joyce's operations on his eyes. You really have to give it to somebody. Of course, he didn't have much of a choice. They were just carving bits of his jaw out bit by bit by bit to try to get rid of the cancer. And of course, he did live into over his 80s, 57 to 30. He died in 39 in London. In fact, he died right around the corner from where I used to live in Belsize Park in London. I could walk by his house anytime I wanted by just going around the corner, which is now, of course, then it was Anna Freud's house, and now it's the Freud Museum. Couldn't have been his, I don't know if they ever got his real couch out of Vienna after the war. Anyway, they recovered some of that stuff and put it into the Freud house. And certainly, if you're interested in Freud, going to the Freud house in North London is really extremely interesting.
So what you said, Mann had intellectual doubts about Freud's theories, but his concepts of sexual repression and the triumph of the instinct kind of set him free to write his greatest work, Death in Venice.
Yeah, I think he does use Freud. On the other hand, Dr. Krukowski in The Magic Mountain, who says all disease is only love repressed. Krukowski he's a kind of parody or ironic creation. I think Mann is making fun of Freud in Dr. Krukowski. I mean, he's a bit of a crackpot. There's a lot of sexual stuff seething around in The Magic Mountain, the novel, partly because there's nothing to do. I mean, if there's nothing else to do and you're dying, the best thing to do is have sex. I mean, get some fun out of life, get a little interest. As I say, the interest is that he's ambivalent, as I am. I take what I can from Freud, but I'm not a Freudian. And a lot of the stuff that he says, I think Moses and monotheism, I don't really believe that theory. And a lot of the stuff is crackpot. Some things, he wrote an essay called "A Child is Being Beaten." And that subject interested me a lot. But when you read it, you don't really get anything out of it. I mean, it seems to me that's a great subject that he threw away. What about it? Why do people beat children, and what effect does beating have on the children? I would have liked to know much more about that. But that's an essay that I think is a failure. But I don't have his complete works, but I have a 5-volume Freud and lots of paperbacks of his other. So I've read a lot in Freud. And a friend of mine says, who thinks Freud is just a load of crap. He said, what do you get out of Freud? Well, I said, insights into literature, as you just said about Death in Venice. This longing that Aschenbach has for Tadzio, but it's sublimated. So Tadzio becomes this kind of idealized Greek figure. And one of the strangest things about Death in Venice is that Aschenbach wants Tadzio to die. He wants him to stay in Venice and be overtaken by the cholera. Why is that? I asked that to my class. Nobody has a clue because it's a hard question. Why does he want him to die? Well, he wants him to die at the height of his perfect beauty, so he never grows old or sick like Aschenbach. And the other thing is he wants him to die before anybody else can enjoy him. He has them all to himself. He follows them all the way through the city, but he never wants to talk to him. But meanwhile, Tadzio's well aware of Aschenbach's infatuation. And in the film, he turns this corner in this dark alley and he turns around and gives Aschenbach this little look like, I know what your feelings are. It's like a flirtatious girl. I mean, I know you want to have physical contact with me, but I'm not allowing it. I'm staying on the pedestal where you put me, even though he sees at the end that the bully on the beach shoves Tadzio's face into the sand and humiliates him in a way that horrifies Aschenbach, who dies, in fact, right after seeing that.
Total aside, but it just made me curious. What about Jung? Have you read much Jung? And what do you think of his work?
Well, that's sort of getting off the subject. No, I think...
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious myself.
Jung's a crackpot. I mean, he doesn't do anything for me. A friend of mine around the corner was a Jungian analyst. I just don't know what that would do. Or there was a colleague who was a Jungian literary. I just don't get any benefit out of Jung at all, apart from the fact that he was anti-Semitic and that he broke with Freud. Freud needed him because he needed some Gentiles along with Jones, because all his followers. So it was considered a Jewish science. He was trying to get away from Jewish science and get some Carl Jungs and Ernest Jones into the group of the select circle who got rings. Met some guy in San Francisco who's, I guess it was his grandfather, had got a ring from Freud, and this, I guess he was just a kid in his 20s, but he had the ring on his finger that Freud had given his grandfather. I really thought that was something. As a biographer, I was very impressed by that. I'm not sure if I asked him if I could try on the ring or not. I'm not sure he was willing to pull it off his finger. But this is what I mean by a kind of tremendous connection to your subject. That's why when you're doing biography, and a lot of my biographical research went into this book, because I've written biographies of a number of the people who are subjects. And the reason that propelled me to do this incredibly arduous biographical research, and do it in a very short period of time, a year a book, not 10. Or somebody says, Jose has been writing this book for 12 years. I'm sure Jose was there 8 hours a day writing. He'd spend months and years without doing anything at all. And then when he sat down at the desk, he'd just be scratching his ass most of the time. But I'm interested in this, not how many years he spent writing it, but how many profitable hours per day where the words were actually, in my case, written down. I don't type on the computer. I write them in the old days. So it's the idea of finding discoveries that's behind the chapters of this book in archives, things that at one point you know more about the subject than anybody else in the world, including wives and children who only know part of the story. They don't know the whole story. The other thing is going around and interviewing people who knew the subject. It's just so interesting. Every word they say, you're kind of hanging on, like Boswell opening his mouth like a fish and trying to catch the words that Johnson was saying. And sometimes I was able to meet extremely distinguished people that I wouldn't have any reason to meet otherwise. Henry Moore, Billy Wilder, Isaiah Berlin, people like that, who would say, after the hour was over and I asked my questions and I get up politely to leave, and they say, no, just have another drink or have a tea, or let's talk a little more. We're sitting out there in an English garden in the summer. It's great stuff, but I haven't got the energy anymore to do those huge biographical things. I read a chapter recently that I wrote about writing the Edmund Wilson biography. I just don't know how I did it, or the work I did on the Wyndham Lewis. Well, you just have to be young. You have to have the energy. Otherwise, you start doing it and then you get nowhere because you need the push, you need the excitement, you need the thrill of pushing on. But I think the idea, which maybe I didn't stress enough in the printed version, is how much biographical information is supporting like some kind of iron substructure, everything that's said in there. There aren't, as far as I remember, there aren't any footnotes in this, or are there?
No, but
I don't think there are any footnotes.
your list at the beginning of the book there, in the opening pages of all your published work, is that's a chapter in itself. Books by Jeffrey Meyers. It goes on for 2 pages and they're full in small print. So I think that gives you a sense. I wanted to come back to Edmund Wilson, actually.
You held this up, but I just want to say this is really a very beautiful book.
It is, yeah.
Louisiana State University Press does produce very handsome books. And I suggested this cover, and these are the 2 French ambassadors to the court of Henry VIII by Holbein, who's one of my favorite painters. And it seems to me it works absolutely perfectly. I just love this cover. It just leads the reader from the cover right into the book in a perfect way, to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so, yeah. So you brought up Edmund Wilson just a second ago. I wanted to ask you also about the feud between him and Alan Tate. Yeah, Edmund Wilson sounds like quite a difficult character. He didn't get along with anybody by the sound of it. But you say that they represented a crucial division in modern American thought and culture, social context versus new criticism in literature. Could you explain what that means and why that was a big deal?
He is contentious, Wilson. And I like contentious subjects. They're more interesting than, say, Archibald MacLeish, who's a very decent, respectable sort of guy. When I was writing Wyndham Lewis, I'll get back to the question in a minute, a friend of mine who is a very smart guy, professor, said, "You'll never finish the book on Wyndham Lewis because you really get to hate him. He's such an unpleasant guy." And the more I did Lewis, the more I liked him. I said, I really like this guy. He's getting into a fight with everyone. He's incredibly critical. I called the book The Enemy, which he called himself. And he published a journal called The Enemy, which he edited. He was the enemy of everybody to his own fault, to his own weakness. And he hurt himself by fighting with all these people who were very powerful and who, instead of helping him, turned against him because he made fun of them. Anyway, I like that. I like Hemingway. He's a quarrelsome sort of guy. And Wilson. Lawrence. He's very short-tempered, partly because he was sick so much of the time, had TB. Orwell gets in there and cross swords with everybody, hates the communists after coming out of the Spanish Civil War. I mean, on one hand, it makes an interesting subject. And on the other hand, it's interesting to do the research on, and it interests the readers, rather than somebody who people like. How many times people open a biography trying to get the reader's interest instead of saying, from the beginning, he was murdered, they found his body, on page 1, and then you want, who is this guy? What murder him? And then you need 600 pages to find out why. Okay, back to Wilson and Tate. Again, I didn't know that much about Tate when I started. He's a very contentious character. It was supposed to be a 2-volume biography of Tate, but nobody ever wrote the second volume, even today. Because when Tate was alive, or when his wife controlled the estate, nobody wanted this stuff to come out. Whatever it is, it still hasn't come out. We knew that he was, by today's terms, people love to throw terms and use racist. Okay, yes, he's a Southerner, born in 1899. So what do you expect? Why cover it all up? You cover it up, and yet people are still thinking it anyhow. So that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So you have a Northerner and a Southerner. You have a Southern agrarian, which is a kind of bring back this pre-Civil War Southern values of, the farmer and, the plantation. And of course, that involves having a whole bunch of blacks as slaves, or at least after they're emancipated, as poorly paid servants, literally picking cotton in the field and doing all the other farm work. So they were just, again, this business of reviewing each other's books. They couldn't resist, You're reviewing the book, and yet, you write a positive review, but you put in some one little knife stab, and that's what the author remembers. If you've gotten reviews, you don't necessarily remember the great stuff. You remember, oh, what a nasty remark that son of a bitch made about my book. That's what you remember.
Well, you said that these two guys, Wilson and Tate, too, they had a lot in common. Like they were both heavy drinkers with serious financial troubles. They're both married multiple times. So it was just like repelling like two poles of a magnet pushing each other apart, in addition to their intellectual differences.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. I mean, just because you have something in common with someone doesn't mean to say you're going to get along with them. It's too bad. The bright guys, both of them, and Tate, he's not one of my favorite writers, but he did write some good poems, and he's a good critic, and he's an intellectual star, and evidently he was a good teacher. He published, as I remember, some books by Wilson when he was working for a publisher, whichever it was. The Nabokov thing is much more interesting than the Tate course, simply because Nabokov is a larger than life figure. I mean, he's one off. There's really no one else like Nabokov, whereas Tate is somewhat like John Crowe Ransom and some of the other people in that Southern agrarian group. But he was important as a teacher, and people like Randall Jarrell, who is a very severe critic, really admired Tate a lot. And I think his criticism holds up pretty well. If you want to go back and find out about so-and-so, you're not going to find a book today which is going to give you enlightened literary criticism. Far from it. Everybody's stuck on theory or feminism or anti-colonialism or calling names and so on, culture cancel. It's just sickening. So
That's tiring.
I see a book on the shelf in a used bookstore, and I can tell by the spine that it is written in the 50s or 60s when I was in college and graduate school. Yeah, that's the kind of book I'd like to read. I'll buy that book and read it, because they were talking about the book. They weren't grinding their axe and trying to pull everybody down, attacking somebody like Orwell. I mean, they should get down on their knees and just kiss the earth and thank God that somebody like Orwell existed instead of trying to pull him down. This book, I won't even mention the name of it. I mean, it was just one of the most disgusting books I ever read. But she made up, in a so-called biography, made up scenes that she said she invented.
Yes, I've heard of this book.
And then criticized Orwell for acting the way he did in the scenes that she made up. And all the women praised it. I didn't see any negative review by a woman. They all said it was great stuff. As long as you're pulling down a male writer, we're all for it.
It's much easier to pull somebody down, and that seems to be the focus these days. It's really, you make a name for yourself by pulling a bigger person down, somebody who's actually accomplished something.
So I said at the end of the review, which was very negative, all you're doing is depriving yourself of the pleasure, intellectual pleasure and aesthetic pleasure of reading a great writer. If you don't want to read Lawrence or Hemingway or Orwell, too bad for you. You're just missing something big. If you want to read a minor woman poet of the 17th century, good luck with it. If you can sustain your interest for more than 5 minutes, great. I'm not interested in that. It's not canceling culture. It's canceling their own rather limited intellectual life.
I want to ask you about another one. One of my favorites, I think my favorite pairing in the book, perhaps, was Evelyn Waugh and Randolph Churchill. It seems strange to me that anyone would put either of these two guys in charge in a wartime situation. Like, you describe Waugh as insubordinate and unable to adjust to regimental life, and Randolph as notoriously drunk, belligerent, and offensive. In short, the two most difficult and disagreeable officers in the British Army. Like, it sounds like the setting for a sitcom.
Well, I like that chapter because it was funny. And Fitzroy MacLean, who really is a very impressive guy. There's a whole biography about him, and I've read a couple of his books. He thinks these two guys would work well together. He knew them personally. What a weird misjudgment. And Waugh was violently opposed to the Yugoslav communist partisans. He had this little whim of referring to Tito as a woman, which is when you're trying to be a liaison officer. with a foreign country. That's really not the best way to do it. But war just didn't give a damn. I mean, he was really a very reckless guy. And that's why they would never let him command anything in the army. He was just so out of control. But he's funny. He's very funny all the time. He's Randolph, I can't remember if it was during the war or after. Anyway, Randolph had this operation exploratory operation to see if he had cancer or not. And when he was clear of cancer, Waugh said that was the only part of his body that was not malignant. I mean, that kind of thing is really great stuff. I mean, you have to admire Waugh for that. Randolph is pretty awful. He was drunk. Well, both of them were drunk. I don't think they accomplished a damn thing as liaison officers in Yugoslavia. Waugh was much more sympathetic to the Ustaše, who were they're the fascist allies of the Nazis. And this guy's supposed to be a liaison officer with the communists, who are the British allies and who are the opposite of the Yugoslav Ustaše or Ustaše fascists. So there's something.
Was that because they were Catholic? Is that that's why he was inclined towards them?
Yeah, that was part of it. Yeah, the Catholic thing came before the political thing, as far as Waugh was concerned. So they send these two guys in there. It's absolutely crazy. And they just get drunk all the time and do foolish things and offend people. And it just went on and on. And Randolph had this tremendous prestige as the son of the wartime prime minister, which is why they sent him there, to show solidarity with the Yugoslavs. But I mean, there was something terribly funny about the whole thing. I really loved writing that. It's comedy.
But what was it about their personalities that clashed? What sparked them off?
I think
of each
they were
other?
big egoists. They were very sharp-witted and clever. They were very heavy drinkers. They were isolated with nothing to do, more or less, but pick on each other. They were both very irritating, especially Randolph. I mean, they were both irritating, but at least Waugh was witty and amusing, whereas Randolph was just irritating without any redeeming features. I mean, there was something sort of oafish about the guy. I mean, he was well-born, he was a good-looking guy, he was rich and he was well-connected, but he I don't think he ever did much in his life. I think his son, who was called Winston also, he's probably still alive. He was an MP, conservative MP, and he wrote a book about Randolph, which I read. It's kind of interesting. But you can hardly call it a successful life. So without going into too much detail, I think the interest there was like if you're making a movie, you take two wildly different characters and you throw them together, and then you see how they react to one another, and you have a film, you have a story, you have a conflict, you have humor. So I thought it was fun writing that one. I really enjoyed that, and it brought a little lightness into the book, which completely the opposite of the Mann Freud, where these two serious German types smoking their cigars and telling each other how great they were.
Do you think things would things have turned out differently in Yugoslavia had someone else been put in charge instead of these two?
Well, I think things would have been smoother. I think there would have been more support for Tito, who they were supposed to be supporting. But if they're writing back negative reports, sometimes even lies, saying Tito refused to fight because he was holding back his arms to fight the fascists after the war. There was some truth to that. But there's no point in holding back your arms. You have to win against the Nazis, and then you fight the fascists. You can't fight the fascists at the same time, which is what they were doing, which is why the war took so long, which is what happened in Spain. When the communists were fighting each other and trying to kill people like Orwell, and then they were fighting on the same side against Franco. That's why they lost the war. Internecine war and intervention of Germany and Italy, but not the Western powers, France and England. That's why Spain lost the war. But nobody ever thinks about this. If the communists had won in Spain, which everybody wanted them to do, you might have had a Stalinist country in Spain rather than a Franco country. And that would have been even worse. So who wants Stalin at the edge of Western Europe? Nobody ever thinks about that. It's just, what there's a word for it. What would have happened if, theoretical history kind of thing. But the Stalinist victory in Spain would not have been a particularly good thing. I lived in Spain for 4 years when Franco was dictator, 71 to 5, and it didn't bother me at all. Every once in a while, the Guardia Civil would walk through our garden without permission. Couldn't say don't do that. They had the right to do it. And anyway, you don't want to get into a fight with the Guardia Civil over nothing. But as soon as Franco died, and I was there then too, it was the spring of 75, anarchy broke out. The Spaniards are a very anarchistic people. There were violent fights, car accidents, breakouts, robberies into the. One thing about when you have a dictatorship, there's very strict law and order. People are afraid and are repressed by the police, and they behave. They follow the law, even if the law is bad. But as soon as there's no law anymore, people went berserk, and all kinds of things were happening that you just never saw before. One time I was stopped by the Guardia Civil when I was driving. And I must say, I did something wrong. I think I overcame on a double line or something like that, and I was stopped. It was a Sunday, and I had a little child, a 2-year-old in the back. So they wanted to give me a ticket, and you sort of had to pay on the spot. They kept some of it, and gave. So I had this, my Spanish was really good then, and I launched into this defense, even though I was in the wrong. I said, if I give this money now, I won't have any, because it was Sunday, you couldn't go to the bank. This is pre-credit card. So I wouldn't have enough money to buy food tonight for my wife and baby daughter. And we argued and argued and argued. And finally, the guy said to me, this is the best compliment I ever had in Spain. He said, que fenomeno, que fenomeno. And he let me off. I thought that was really great. I argued for 15 minutes in Spanish. But my Spanish wasn't perfectly correct, but it was fluent and clear. And I guess he never heard a foreigner speak Spanish in quite that way, where your meaning comes across, but it's not proper Spanish.
Okay, well, so one more story from the book then, before we wrap up. So what was your favorite pairing to write about?
Maybe it's Diane Arbus, Sylvia Plath. That's really interesting because, first of all, they never met, though they were contemporary. And I thought, and they both committed suicide. And they were both very talented artists. And again, I knew a lot about Sylvia Plath. I'd written about her in books and articles, but I didn't know anything much about Diane Arbus. Read a couple of biographies, and as I read them and looked at her photography, and this freakish aspect of Diane Arbus's photography was really a lot like some of the extreme poems, and especially some of the extremely painful scenes in The Bell Jar, which I think is a very, very good book. She published it, I think, just a couple of months before she killed herself. Didn't really get anywhere at all. It was published under a pseudonym, Victoria Greenwood or something like that, which was an English translation of her grandmother's or her mother's maiden name, Grunewald. So again, I started seeing the similarities. It's really so interesting. You have girls the same age, very unhappy lives, mental breakdowns, depression, violence, freakish art forms. It's kind of an unhappy marriage, suicide. It's a sad story, and the book ends on that rather tragic note. But I thought that was a very good example of starting off with a real deep knowledge of Sylvia Plath and virtually no knowledge at all about Diane Arbus, and then working up the Diane Arbus, not thinking when I started that I'm going to connect this to Sylvia Plath because I didn't know anything about Diane Arbus. Can't remember the name of the biography, but there's a couple of biographies about her, and they're both quite good. And as I read on and read more, I just kept making these connections. And this is what I find so interesting when I wrote this book. I hope readers will find it interesting too, because these people had not been paired before. This is the first time. And to me, the parallel lives really worked. It worked for me as a writer. It worked when it's published, and it's out there now for the readers to read if they ever do, and to see how these pairs, thesis of the book, how the pairs illuminate the writers more than looking at them individually.
Well, I think that's where we'll leave it. I really enjoyed the book, and for me, I think the most enjoyable thing was the many new reading tangents it opened up in each chapter for me. So there's lots to follow up on that was so interesting and lots of threads to chase. So thank you for your time today, Jeffrey. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Okay, so long.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.